We welcome you again to Business Day. I'm John Ehrlichman, and joining me now with our top-line story, Jameson Burko. Jameson, you've been going through this speech coming from the head of the CMHC, which is once again raising some red flags about the outlook for our Canadian housing industry.
It's quite remarkable here, John. You usually see these speeches as an opportunity to just lay out some boilerplate issues, explain what the CMHC does, since, of course, this was a speech given outside of Canada, and so it isn't always clear, even to many Canadians, the role of the major national housing watchdog, but definitely not the case with Evan Siddle's speech in London. He is rallying against critics of the next round of federal housing regulations that are currently in the discussion phase. That is the idea of getting banks to share in some of the risk involved in the possibility of mortgages that are defaulting. Because right now, all of that risk is being shouldered by the CMHC, at least as far as insured mortgages go, and there's talks with banks having to pick up a piece of that. He points out in his speech how critics say this is a solution in search of a problem, but he vehemently disagrees, saying, and this is clear quoting from this text of the speech itself, that those critics don't mention that the Canadian system has not been stressed since the Great Depression. Further, they choose to ignore the strong academic support that loudly warns against the drunken brew of elevated house prices and an advanced credit cycle. So pretty powerful words here, John, particularly reminding investors, global investors here, just how much debt has been piled on the backs of Canadian homeowners and their increasing inability to handle any further debt loads, which increased interest rates would actually create.
I would say two things. I mean, it is a little unusual for, to your point, for him to be in London talking about the Canadian housing industry, but to connect the dots, this is someone who spent time at the Bank of Canada and has a relationship with Mark Carney, who was the Bank of England governor, of course, used to run our central bank. So there is the connection. But to your point, anyone who were to look at a chart of the level, I mean, we sat here yesterday and talked about the level of household debt that Canadians have taken on, in large part because of the size of mortgages to just get into the housing markets that are hot in Toronto and Vancouver, that has put us in a position where the amount of debt that we have compared to income has been rising at an alarmingly high rate, and is much higher right now, by the way, than what you see in the United States.
It's truly astounding when you look at the threshold that the Bank of Canada sets for what, say, a mortgage or any large level of debt that any Canadian might take out would be considered risky, to the point where they had a reasonably high chance of defaulting on being able to make the payments for that debt. The ratio is about 350%. So to give you a real world number, that says if you make even $100,000 per year, that's your salary, and you take out a mortgage for more than $350,000, you're automatically in that category. Then you look at, say, all the new mortgages that were issued in just the city of Toronto last year, 40% of them, so huge proportion of them, well over a third, nearly half, that are going to people who are taking out mortgages for more than 450% of their income, and that was throughout the entirety of 2015. It's amazing, and now, of course, we have these new rules in place so that it's not as possible, it's more difficult to be able to take on a mortgage that's so highly leveraged against your income, but that's kind of
the problem
recapping it from here.
With that is that those were steps that were taken by the federal government within the last couple of months before Donald Trump was elected as the president and before the bond market reacted in a very aggressive way by selling bonds, pushing up yields, and now mortgage rates starting to rise in this country to the point where we've already heard from the CMHC this week about what could potentially occur as a result of that. You highlighted the fact that they have exposure. We have seen them try to lessen their exposure to the market. The banks in Canada maybe not as on the hook, if you will, for that worst case scenario at all. That didn't stop, I don't think, the CMHC, though, in sort of thinking about the potential worst case scenarios of talking about a financial institution getting caught right in the red of all of this, if there's one of those, worst case scenarios.
But you know what seems distressing, as just personally for me, as a one time would like to be a homeowner in one of Canada's major cities, and generally make a good enough income that should be possible to some extent, certainly not with home prices the way they are, but what was missing yesterday when they saw the stress test, what was missing over a month ago when they did that very first red alert on the Canadian housing market, and what's missing in the speech, what are we going to do about it? He says, well, we can't raise interest rates. That's too blunt an instrument, was the way he put it in his speech. He points out that it's interesting and perhaps worthwhile and one of the most significant changes to work on this risk sharing, but is that going to address the concern that he puts in no uncertain terms really could jeopardize our economic future, as you put it at the top of the program? So our economic future is in jeopardy, according to the head of our housing watchdog. Housing, by the way, the strongest by far sector in our economy. What are we going to do to solve what seems to be hurtling towards a cliff?
That is another important point. The amount of our economic growth that at this stage in the game is coming directly from housing. Maybe putting out a speech like this helps to just get him on the record on these issues, because in this same speech he also makes the point that this organization's role in part is to try to encourage all Canadians to be able to own homes. When you look at the leverage ratios that one has to basically take on from a debt perspective to actually buy into the market, I think I noticed it at the end of the speech. He was trying to say that's not really something that I or we envisioned happening, but we're kind of looking at that kind of scenario right now.
And it's such an unusual scenario that just a couple of years ago we would never have looked at. It's amazing how quickly things can change in that sense, John.